First of all, Jackie, let me say how honored I feel to be here among all of you this afternoon who done such amazing work over the years. I remember a moment when I was living here in Los Angeles, when I was very much involved with organizations like SNCC, LA SNCC, and the Black Panther Party. I remember organizing around the case of a young black man who had been killed by a sheriff's deputy. And I remember the conversations that some of us were having about the leader who was the primary spokesperson for that movement. We were calling for a people's tribunal, community responses against violence. And this was in the late 60s, before we actually had a vocabulary that allowed us to talk about intimate violence or domestic violence. And so we all knew that this man, who was this passionate spokesperson against racist violence, we all knew that he was inflicting violence on his partner at home. And we knew that that was wrong, but we did not have the political language that allowed us to connect that violence that was happening in his home with the violence that was happening in the street against which he was protesting. So that's one of the first memories that I have of the movement against domestic violence. There was a time when the police would not even respond to an instance of domestic violence. As a matter of fact, if they arrived at a particular site and discovered that it was a man beating his wife or his girlfriend or whatever, their response would be, "Oh, this is a domestic issue. This isn't a matter for the police." And they would leave. In the meantime, the man could, kill his partner. And so we know that it has been important to create the kind of movement that makes the world look at intimate violence in a very different way. But of course, in the process, we end up using the resources that exist. And the resources that exist have been resources of the state. And while I think strategically it may have been important to force the state to recognize that intimate violence is violence, when we rely primarily on criminalization, we not only contribute to the buildup of a prison industrial complex, but we engage in the kind of strategy that may very well militate against the goal. If in insisting on criminalization and relying primarily on the criminal justice system, we send more people, more men primarily, to prison, which is a very violent place, which is a place that is about the reproduction of violence. And certainly if our goal, as Peter pointed out, is to end domestic violence, then we don't want to engage in the kinds of strategies that are going to constantly reproduce that violence that we think we are challenging. So I think this is precisely a moment when we have to look at that contradiction very seriously and begin to figure out other ways of addressing violence. On the one hand, it seems like we've come a long way, and I think back to those days when you could not even talk about domestic violence, when that was a taboo subject. But it seems that we have not really come as far as we should have by now, and that yes, survivors always need community, and I would say community rather than institutions. I'm always really ambivalent about institutionalization. And I think even as we build institutions, we have to resist institutionalization. We have to resist normalization. Because what often happens is that we forget to ask questions. We assume that the institution is the answer, and we forget to question the very frameworks within which we are working. And I think it is possible to embrace all of the work and to be really excited and to celebrate the work that has happened, and at the same time ask hard questions. You know, I try to ask myself questions about this all the time. How can we both participate in building institutions and at the same time question ourselves, learn how to constantly ask the kinds of questions that will prevent us from becoming, frozen in these institutionalized positions. And I know there's a lot of discussion about, racism and homophobia and class bias and transphobia within the domestic violence movement, because as Beth Ritchie points out, and I really love her analysis, again I would recommend her book. She talks about what she calls the every woman paradox. That what happens is that we began to make this issue available, accessible to everyone by arguing, well, it could happen to anyone. But the problem is that every woman paradox came to assume that the representative was a white, middle-class woman who could have a lawyer and a doctor and access to all of these services. And in the process, precisely because of this attempt to demonstrate that it can happen to anyone, those who are most vulnerable get marginalized. And I think we have to be aware of the extent to which we ourselves often become implicated in the very processes we are trying to critique. And I don't know how to avoid that other than by, and this is what I tell my students too, always learning how to raise questions and to question that which appears to be the most normal state of affairs, because we get ensconced in our own normalities that then prevents us from recognizing the degree to which we become implicated in the continuation of violence against women and gender violence more broadly. There's a great deal of discussion about intersectionality, right? And that term came out of an effort to address issues within the domestic violence movement. If you look at Kimberly, Crenshaw's. But I think that we have to think about that concept more broadly. It's not just intersectionality of identities. And perhaps we need to go further than intersectionality. We need to talk about the ways in which issues are interconnected, and struggles are not only intersectional, but they're cross-hatched and they overlay each other. So that while, of course, we cannot assume that we can engage in every struggle on every front. So frustrated, I can't do it all. So what if domestic violence is related to institutional violence in prisons and violence on the street and military violence, and we can go on and on. But how can I resist all of these violences simultaneously? And that's not really the question. The question is to do the work that we do. And to do it passionately, but recognize that it takes place against the backdrop of interconnections with all kinds of struggles. And so while I may not be specifically involved in immigrant rights struggle, recognize that if I'm involved in the domestic violence movement, then certainly I have to take into consideration the degree to which the repression of immigrants is so closely connected with the anti-violence movement. Or domestic violence is often viewed in a very narrow gender frame. That is to say, the kind of the notions of gender that we've grown up with. It's a binary structure of gender, male, female. But what happens if our whole notion of gender expands? What does that say for intimate violence? And how do we think the relations between trans violence and violence against men in prison, rape that happens in prison, that is a direct result of the degree to which the institution uses violence for the purpose of being able better to manage captive populations. And that's just the beginning of an answer, but I will stop.